Welcome to the Connected Enterprise Podcast. This is Carl Lewis, your host, and my guest today is Dan Balcauski. Dan, welcome to the podcast. Tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you do and the company you have.
Great to be here, Carl. I'm excited for a conversation. Thank you for having me on the Connected Enterprise. Yeah, I've spent my entire 20-year career in software. Currently, I am a founder of a consultancy down in Austin, Texas called Product Tranquility. We help high volume B2B SaaS CEOs define pricing and packaging for both new and existing products. As I mentioned, I spent my entire 20-year career in software. I started more on the value creation side than the value capture side that I'm on today. So first as a software engineer, actually writing code, I was doing low-level driver development. I blue screen more Windows machines than I can possibly count. I don't know if there's a badge for that somewhere, but I probably I'm in the running for maybe top on that. And then into engineering management, ultimately I became a lot more fascinated by how our products created customer value and turned into dollars for the business. And this interest led me to pursue my MBA. I didn't realize it, but I was quite lucky with my MBA. My program was widely recognized for its excellence in marketing, but I didn't find out until very recently. Very few MBA programs have courses and prices, so I received my theoretical grounding there. And then during my internship, I worked for a very successful Silicon Valley startup, and they had a problem on the CEO's desk. I won't go into full detail, but ultimately it was trying to decide whether they should do a freemium approach. TLDR, I looked at it in depth and have since, and generally a terrible idea. So we could get into that if you want later, but threw me into the real world of pricing off the bat. And after grad school, I was more on the product management, product strategy side. The company I worked for, we acquired a bunch of other smaller companies, tucked them into our portfolio. And then at any one time, I was managing 3 to 4 different products. So I saw a lot of mistakes early stage companies would make, both in their product management, product strategy, and in their pricing and packaging. And so now I have the privilege of helping founders, CEOs, and their teams build sustainable business, helping them get their products in the hands of as many customers as possible.
It's an interesting, as I told you when we first met, I had never really met anybody who was call them a pricing specialist that really advised people on this.
There's
And
not
so
many
I
of us.
thought, my opinion is maybe there's a need for it. You have something you call the 3 C's of pricing. Can you tell us what that is?
Yeah, so I didn't come up with the 3 C's of pricing. I don't want to claim for that, but I think that one thing marketers always love are acronyms. 3 C's, you get maybe 5 C's sometimes, 4 P's of marketing. Ultimately, what the 3 C's stand for is cost-based pricing, competition-based pricing, and customer value-based pricing. Often just said value-based pricing, but if we did that, we'd drop the C and that wouldn't be any fun for marketers. These are what we call pricing orientation. So pricing orientation is really how is pricing done around here? What are ultimately the things that we look at when we're trying to determine pricing and packaging? And the way I look at those three, the cost-based, competition-based, and customer value-based pricing, it's a ladder. You can't jump to the end of customer value-based pricing without taking the other rungs on the way there. What is ultimately what we're trying to do? We're trying to look at different inputs that would have an influence on how we ultimately create the pricing and packaging that we set for a product. So most folks will start with a cost-based pricing example. So it's ultimately very simple, pretty clear cut. The data you need is generally within the firm. Even if you're doing a value-based pricing approach, at the end of this, it can help you set a price floor below which your pricing is unprofitable. But it has a bunch of drawbacks. Like ultimately, your customers don't care about your costs; they only care about your problems. Although it seems very quantitative, finance folks really like it, or finance accounting types really like it because you get a spreadsheet and like I got my cost of goods sold, I've got a markup, and it looks very scientific. Ultimately, it is qualitative because although the output is a quantity, your markup that you're using for a cost-based approach is qualitative. Adam Smith, economic god, went to your CFO and said, "You guys deserve an 80% gross margin or 30% gross margin or whatever it might be. You made that up." So ultimately, although it seems quantitative, it is quite qualitative. Ultimately, there's no consideration of customers' willingness to pay or your product's perceived value or your competition. Those have drawbacks, but it is a fine place to start because, again, if you are pricing below your costs, unless you've got unlimited amounts of venture capital or private equity funding that's going to sustain your business, you do eventually have to turn a profit. You can't lose money on every sale and then make it up on volume, as the old saying. So then we graduate to competition-based pricing, like cost-based pricing, relatively simple concept to understand. Now we're immersing ourselves into a market dynamic. What is available to our customers as they're considering a purchase? So it opens up that aperture. Data is not as readily available as in cost-based pricing, but it can be usually pretty straightforward to collect. There may be different markets that are more transparent or opaque that may make it more difficult, but ultimately you can get the data. Some of the drawbacks to a competition-based approach, though, it generally outsources the work of your pricing department to your competition. I don't know any CEO that would happily give their competitive CEOs the driving controls of their product strategy or of their acquisition strategy or of their marketing collateral. But if you just rely on your competition only, you're fundamentally giving that power to your competition to help drive. It assumes your competitors as well have done their homework. One thing I learned early in my career as a product leader is don't get caught up in your competitors' announcements of the new features that they've announced, because that assumes that the product managers have really done their homework. You don't know if the new feature they're just announced was a bright idea the CEO had on a golf course or the chat with his buddy, or if it was some unresearched machination of some product leader inside the building to come up with this thing. So if we just outsource our pricing to our competitors, it really doesn't help us that much. It ultimately has the same drawbacks as a cost-based pricing. It doesn't consider customers' willingness to pay. Ultimately, it could be challenging if we're in one of these more opaque markets that competitive data isn't as easy to get. So finally, we get to value-based pricing. And again, I want to stress the fact that you can't get all the way to value-based pricing without going through the other two. You do need to understand your costs and your competition if you're going to do value-based pricing. But really what we're layering on in the value-based approach is a customer-focused. We're trying to align our company's profitability with the value our customers receive from our product. Most research supports this orientation as a superior way to price products, although it's difficult. I would say it's a North Star to be shot for, never to be attained, because it is quite difficult. And even the most recent studies I've seen on this, probably only about 20% of companies actually do true value-based pricing, because it's quite difficult. You need to have a very mature understanding of your market. Some of the cons: it does require an internal organizational reorientation of your pricing philosophy. You can almost think of it as a go-to-market model. You can't just have your pricing team go into a back room somewhere and then spring out on the rest of the company and your market. Hey, this is what we realized our customers would get. It needs to be supported by an entire value philosophy throughout the organization, because you need value-based selling, messaging, value-based customer success for it to be successful. Otherwise, it's going to fall flat. And it really demands a deep understanding of the market, the customer segments you serve via research, which can generally be more costly in terms of both time and money. So those speak to some of the reasons why it's maybe less adopted.
Value-based pricing, I hear that talked about a lot. How do you discover what the value really is? And who's going to tell you that? Is it a bit of a moving target? I've found in the world of SaaS, as we started doing things in the cloud and whatnot, people would try to do these ROI evaluations of, is it cheaper, more cost effective to do it on premises or in the cloud? That didn't always work. And so now I think they're looking a lot at what's the value of the cloud. And that is still a moving target because it hasn't been that long. We don't have all the knowledge yet. From your perspective, how do you get at what the value really is?
You ever hear the joke about the three umpires?
Not recently.
Manager goes up to the three umpires, is like, hey guys, I really don't understand how you guys call balls and strikes. It's just a mystery to me. So the three umpires stand there. So the first guy goes, well, it's easy. I call them as I see them. Second umpire goes, I call them as they are. And the third's shaking his head, non-disagreeing, and says, they ain't nothing till I call them. So we can think about value through these couple of views, right? So the first umpire is really kind of taking the perspective that values exist. It's like the temperature outside or your heart rate. People perceive them and report them as best as you can, maybe with some bias. The second umpire is taking more the perspective that people know their values and preferences directly, like they would 2 + 2 = 4. That's, I call them as they are. And the third is values or preferences are constructed in the process of elicitation, and they ain't nothing till I call them. And we see this in our day-to-day life, maybe not quite explicitly, but this is a whole keeping up with the Joneses phenomenon. Your neighbor pulls up in his brand new car, right? You didn't really think you needed a new car, but all of a sudden you're like, I think I need a new car, right? The elicitation there is indirect, it's implicit, but all of a sudden our wants, our values are getting drawn out of us because of our external environment. And we see this a lot if you have more of an enterprise type sales motion. And I deal with this a lot in consulting, where oftentimes people will be like, we need help with our pricing, right? Or you could insert whatever, we need help with X. And they really haven't thought through all of the implications of why that is. And so understanding that value really comes from our process, which is asking customers about their business. The trick ultimately is to drive the discussion to a dollar sign, try to get an answer to financial value. And I generally focus on B2B. So that tends to be a little bit more possibility. If you're in more of a B2C market, you might deal with more intangible values like a brand or emotional outcomes, social outcomes that might be a little bit more difficult to get to. But in a B2B context, generally, we can probe for understanding, what are the most pressing problems and issues they have around the product or service they're exploring? What are the solutions that they're using to address those needs now? And ultimately, how do their current solutions cost them either time, money, or opportunity? What would be the estimated magnitude if we could address those cost savings? How might they save additional time or money or realize additional monetary gains? So ultimately, it comes from that deep conversation with customers to try to get out of them. How do they create value for their customers? What does their process look like? Where would we fit in from that solution?
I've done a little bit of that kind of work with clients in the consulting business, but I would say that it's the unusual sales professional can have that deeper conversation with customers about that kind of value. I think that's why this value-based approach is more the uncommon one, because it does take so much work. You have to somehow take that and filter it back. Got to make that full circle in order for those making the decisions about pricing to factor that in. If you had 60 salespeople and there's two or three of them doing it, trying to get those two guys to get that information back to the leadership for input would be really important. They're the ones gathering it.
Yeah, ultimately, what you like to do, it really depends upon the kind of product or service that you're engaging in. For consulting offer, it might be too customized person to person to make it kind of copy paste. But
Mhm.
what you might do instead, if for the kind of companies that I service, which is more product companies, you might have your product team or pricing team, or maybe your product marketing team doing sets of in-depth investigation with customers in your market. Could be prospects or people that are generally in your ideal customer profile, right? That might not be customers yet, to have these type of deep elicitation conversations. We may or may not get to it in this conversation, but one of the fundamental pillars on which I base a lot of my pricing and packaging work is on customer segmentation. So the idea would be this sort of expeditionary force is going ahead, having really in-depth conversations, synthesizing that into personas that represent the different customer segments that help the rest of the team really grasp at a high level. Okay, here's the value drivers. Here's what these particular customers care about. Here's why their context dictates the value that our product can help them achieve. That can turn into other sales enablement collateral, whether that's demo scripts or qualification questions to determine, okay, what kind of customer am I dealing with? I agree. The value conversation, and this is not a easy skill. It takes a lot of practice, and it's not something I think that everybody can do. So if you have it in that scenario, right, you can have that early work help enable the rest of the company.
I've found that even the customers don't always know how to answer the questions because they just know it hurts. They don't know how to value that in terms
Yeah.
of that cost internally. Do you think that the whole concept of pricing gets enough attention in most companies?
Absolutely not. There's some statistics I saw that even among Fortune 500 companies, I think it was like 75% do not have a dedicated pricing organization. And then again, even in the Fortune 500, I think it was something like a third or a little bit more than a third have no pricing titles in their organization at all. I was working with a SaaS CEO recently on a pricing. We were discussing an engagement, and in the middle of the proposal process, they had a 3-day exec strategy offsite. The week after the meeting, I met with them and say, okay, based upon what you guys did for 3 days, what has changed regarding this pricing project we're discussing? And he said, we didn't discuss pricing. And I was like, could you imagine that? It's like 3 full days of strategic planning with your entire executive C-suite, 0% of that time devoted to pricing. I've said this many times, but I think there's 3 ways to ultimately grow your SaaS business, which is acquisition, monetization, retention. Just way too often companies put all of their focus on acquisition. I think you may be seeing a little bit of that shift with some of the macro changes that we're seeing. Obviously retention is becoming very dear to folks as the acquisition has been harder to come by. And then I think monetization is growing as a growth lever. But I
Mhm.
think that's been a downfall. The appropriate measures for that large growth opportunity.
For sure. Who typically do you find is responsible, and then maybe who should be responsible for pricing decisions inside of most companies?
One of the fundamental problems that I see is a lack of a pricing process or governance. It's nobody's problem directly, even though everyone's affected by it. So even if someone recognizes an issue, there's usually no systematized process to address it.
Right.
So absolutely, I think somebody should own it, own the process, own the updating of that process, right? What's the checkpoints? The way I think about it at the early stage of a company, the founders own pricing, but that's because there's no one else to do it, right? They're writing the code, they're making the sales, they're writing the marketing copy, they're doing everything. If we think as those companies evolve, well, hey, we need more engineers to write more code, we need more salespeople to make some deals, we need more marketing people to do what the marketing folks do, et cetera, to support people to help support customers. You imagine that as those roles scale, at no point is there really like, okay, well, let's bring a pricing person in. Especially generally, my rule of thumb is about 200 million in revenue and multi-product for you to bring in your first full-time pricing person. And so if you think you've got from founding when the founders had it to, and then they get busy with everything else, there's no one who's explicitly responsible for it. So generally what I recommend is PMM should own pricing, product marketing, and also they should establish a pricing committee or pricing council. Ultimately, I think they are best positioned to hold the strategic aspects of the company in mind. What is the long-term goals? PMM usually is responsible for the ownership and caretaking of positioning, and I believe pricing is a function of your positioning, and so it makes sense to have those as a shared home. They usually have a good sense of what the value is because they are responsible, large part for positioning and therefore the messaging, and they're able to have some of these deep, insightful conversations that we were speaking of earlier.
Interesting. How does a company tell if they need to fix their pricing or optimize their pricing? When is it time? Because it's like you said, it gets ignored, but from time to time, any place I've ever been, there are discussions about, well, should we raise those prices? Is it time? Can our customers stand those prices? How often? What are some of the basic rules of thumb that you could give people?
Yeah, well, there's no magic number to say how often. I can touch on that in a bit. I think some of the high level strategic questions I might ask is, are you meeting your goals? Is pricing getting away with those goals? If you recently implemented a pricing change or increase, did it succeed? Why are you losing deals? Is price playing a role compared to other factors in an outsized manner? Maybe some more tactical questions that I might ask would be, are too many customers buying and staying in your entry level plan? Are too few customers upgrading or expanding? Is sales regularly selling something that is customized for each deal? There's a whole bunch of different strategic questions we might ask. And then again, getting down to the tactical, everything from discounting policy. Is there internal friction? Is pricing creating internal friction between different aspects of the company or different operating units? Those are some of the things we might think of there. In terms of is there a magic number or magic time as which to change your pricing? Generally, no. I don't think companies do it often enough. I would say it generally makes sense to revisit it at least once per year. But look, companies are constantly improving their products. If we think about pricing, one of its fundamental relationship is to value. Your value is constantly changing because you're constantly improving your product, right? You're shipping new releases, you're adding new features. So are your competitors. So your differentiated value is changing. So to say like, well, you should do it, at this time on clockwork, it's going to depend. Did inflation just spike to 10% or historical numbers hasn't been seen in 50 years? Has your competitor just massively changed how they go to market? Obviously, you might have more structural issues going on that you need to address in real time. Generally found that companies that revisit their pricing packaging more often do grow a lot faster.
You work with a lot of companies that are creating new SaaS software. With a new product, it seems to me like it's probably really imperative that you get it right out of the box. But what I've seen with existing products is like they could have a 10-year shelf life already, and they've added 1,000 new features, but the license price, shall we say, hasn't changed from day one to 10 years later. It's still the same basic cost to the user. Is it more difficult for people to raise pricing on an existing product? Is that why that happens? Why they get fixed in a spot?
It's funny because part of my answer to your question is almost a response to what you implied in the beginning of your question. You talked about pricing for a new product. It's really imperative to absolutely get right. And look, I think the level of rigor that I see most companies apply to that definitely needs some improvement. But I think there is a big fear around pricing and packaging of like, oh, well, it has to be perfect or else we can't do anything to it. It does have this reputation of being more black box magic voodoo than it actually is. Like there's definitely art and science, but it's definitely more science than it is art. There's a couple of different things that happen. One is pricing is in many ways opportunity cost. And opportunity cost doesn't show up on your P&L. The COO every month is sitting down with the VP of engineering or CTO being like, look at these AWS costs. Oh my God, what are your engineers doing? We got to improve this because these bills are spiking. And that's a direct cost that person gets on their desk, and they're they're probably incentivized. Part of their bonus is like, how do you help us control our costs? Whereas the company is selling, let's just say at $10 a user, and they could be selling at $100 a user. Well, nobody sees that. There's no invoice that shows up on the president or the CEO's desk that says, "Oh man, we're losing 90% of our revenue here to what we should be doing with our pricing." That is a major issue. It's just sort of out of sight, out of mind. Combined with this, it looks like black magic voodoo, and people are afraid to touch it. Those are a couple of factors as to why.
For sure. It's difficult, I think, for people to increase prices, but sometimes you have to. I mean, things can't be the same forever in terms of their value. Maybe prices need to go down. Maybe it doesn't have as much value as it used to have. I don't know. When you raise a price on something, how do you really communicate that with customers and execute that throughout the company in a way that makes sense?
We kind of talked about why people ignore it. So, what might be some signals that you should maybe look at to determine if it's a good idea? And then I can absolutely talk about how to kind of execute some of those. So, look, if your prospects don't push back on pricing, you should be seeing some amount of healthy pushback on pricing, deals lost to pricing. Hopefully, you're tracking win loss codes. And win loss systems, as they're maintained by sales, like in your CRM, for example, are a good start. I never would view them as the God's honest truth. Anything maintained by the person that lost the deal is going to have some bias. They're going to not have full information from their side because of the relationship they have with the lost prospect. But, a healthy sort of rule of thumb would be you should be losing about a third of your deals to price. And, if you look in your win loss codes and you see none of them are getting lost to price, you probably have a good signal that you should be raising your prices. Customers actively tell you how cheap you are or actively tell you how crazy of an ROI you guys create for them. If you haven't touched your pricing for years, if you've improved the product dramatically without additional monetization, and I'm seeing this quite a bit recently. One thing that's happened as the economy was expanding and just going gangbusters over the last couple of years, we had this seat-based pricing model. So like Salesforce, for example, every sales rep who has access to the CRM is charged a user license. As people are adding headcount, that's a beautiful tailwind to the companies that have that business model. Well, macro conditions change. Those tailwinds turn into headwinds. So companies start reducing force in many sectors. And so that becomes a challenge. And also, these companies have realized that, in a massive bid for market share, we were just add value, add value, add value, and we didn't monetize it. So they added additional automation capabilities. And we're seeing a lot of discussion of AI. So companies are like, wow, not only can we make do with less people, but it's even better than we thought. Like our people we have are way more efficient. The companies have kind of sowed the seeds of their own demise in a way, because in a bid to add more value without monetizing it, they're now reaping the results of what they've sown by not monetizing effectively. So those are some of the signals I might look at. And then when you think about changing prices, again, one thing I might apply to almost any any business decision I think it works out is I always want to think about different customer segments. So the easy one to think of in terms of a price change is new business versus current customers. There could be an interesting philosophical argument to say, if you change your new list prices, say on your website for people that aren't customers, did you really change prices? Because for me, I'm a pricing nerd. So I do time to time just track people's prices because it's interesting and it's useful for my job. But I don't think most normal people are doing that day to day. So, if you execute a price change, it's just a list price publicly for non-existing customers. Ways we can go about it, but usually those are less worrisome, I think, to most leaders than changing prices on existing customers. And so if we think about our plans can be different for both of those. For existing customers, I want to think through potentially announcements and timelines for changes well in advance. So one thing we run into in a B2B case that we often don't run into as much in a B2C case is, let's say, Netflix. I bet you the price per account for Netflix looks like just a uniform distribution, whatever. Everyone's paying $10 a month or whatever. And there's a little bit of bump in variation for different packages, but that's not what you have in a B2B case. You've probably got 20% of your accounts that make up 80% of your revenue. And so we want to think through the 80% of accounts that is 20% of our revenue. Maybe we'll look at them as test rollout cohorts of our messaging, of our price changes, so that by the time we get to our very sensitive enterprise accounts, we've got a very good playbook. We know what objections we're potentially going to run into. We've got give gets that we've armed the sales team with. We've got our messaging down pat. We've got different negotiation plays that are available to us, right? And we're not poor sales guys on the phone with our largest account at JP Morgan, and he's having a conversation for the first time. It's probably not a recipe for success.
Yeah.
There's a lot of debate in our world about grandfathering. I don't think that there's grandfathering being, if you make a price change, your pricing or packaging change, should you leave existing customers on their old plans? I don't think there is a one size fits all answer. With anything else, you have to weigh the positives and negatives. Ultimately, there is a cost to maintaining customers on legacy pricing over the long term. It adds complexity to invoicing and revenue systems. There are many ways to approach this. And I think if you are strategic in terms of segmenting those customers up front, you can create a more nuanced plans that works and maintains and helps you grow the revenue that you hope to gain by your price change.
This has been really interesting. And I know that your chosen field is software, and in the SaaS world is where you're doing a lot of your work these days. But this was great advice for just about any kind of company dealing with customers and pricing of products, just about any sort. So we appreciate your time today. Thanks for sharing with us on the Connected Enterprise.
Well, I appreciate the time, Carl. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And to all the rest of you, till we meet again, stay connected.